Right. Hello and welcome to Beginner Breakdown. I'm Sara Herman, your host for tonight. I brought a game with me that I thought could be useful for a lot of different levels. I've been having trouble transitioning from teaching Road to 2000 to Beginner Breakdown because what is a beginner? It's hard to define. I've asked a lot of people and they define it in different ways, but I first want to ask the audience what their experience is with chess. Like, are we just learning how to move pieces? We know how all the pieces work? We know basic fundamentals? Do we have a rating? Anyone?
This is probably my third or fourth class introduction to chess. I'm starting to kind of understand how most of the pieces work.
Okay. All right, thank you. That helps me a lot because I definitely don't want anyone to be left out here. So this is a game I played against a child, and that's something that we all experience in chess these days is losing to children. That wasn't this game, but I'll just go through it and feel free to ask any questions about anything. No question is too there's no bad questions, is what I'm trying to say. So white opens up with e4, very normal move, just trying to develop the knight and the bishop and the queen, getting ready for kingside castling, and also contributing to the center. So I play the move c5, which is referred to as the Sicilian defense, and the idea of it is instead of putting my own pawn in the center, like most openings, I put one of my wing pawns in the center that's still contributing, stopping white from ever having two central pawns. And all you really need to know about the Sicilian is whenever they play d4, you take it without thinking, because whenever you can trade a side pawn for a center pawn, it's almost always a good thing. So my opponent plays knight f3, and I go d6, which can be a knight orb, can be a dragon, can be many things. The general idea is just controlling more central squares, letting this piece breathe a little bit, giving me more options. So d4, we already established, I'm taking it right away. And now black has two central pawns. White has a knight in the center and is currently ahead in development, but I can catch up quite quickly with knight f6, attacking the e-pawn here. And so white has a choice how to defend the e-pawn. He opts for knight to c3, and knight c3 is a good move, but it does have drawbacks. Usually in d4 openings, so like this, white's almost always playing the move c4 and putting the knight behind the pawns, so it can contribute to the center without blocking the pawn that can also contribute. But in this position that we got, he had to play knight c3, and now giving up the option of playing c4, which for some of the more advanced people, this would be called the Marozzi bind structure. And it would give white lots of control over this d5 square. But this also leaves the knight more vulnerable to pins, not necessarily in this case. So I played the move a6, which is, we're still in theory, but my idea is that there are three pieces that potentially want to go to the square, and I'm stopping it before it ever happens. Bishop e2, very normal. White's getting ready to castle. And I play the move e5. So e5 does require quite a bit of discussion and understanding. So when it comes to pawn structure, I usually, when I talk to beginners and I teach beginners, I start with the end game. Which is something that requires you to build a pawn, which is why a class like this, where you have different people every time, it's kind of hard to build up on ideas. But what I will say is that pawn structure-wise, let me go back. When we think of a strong pawn chain, we think of a pawn here, and they're all being supported. And the longer the pawn chain, we usually think the better. when I play the move pawn to e5, this is still kind of a pawn chain. But what's the big difference, do we think, between this pawn chain and a more normal one?
What's a pawn chain?
So a pawn chain would be like, here, let me go to a position. This is kind of a pawn chain right here, where the pawns in the back are supporting each pawn that goes forward, and they're kind of linked in a way. And so they're very strong because you can't really get rid of this pawn without killing this pawn, and you can't get rid of this pawn without killing this pawn. And the further back the pawn, the harder it is to attack. And, you know, it's like the saying, the weakest link, something about the weakest link of a chain, in this case is the one that's furthest back. But if we go to the position on the board, it's quite a short pawn chain. I don't know if you could even consider it one. But the difference is it's not being supported by a pawn here. If the pawns were like, this pawn was here and this pawn was here, it would be very strong. This is, the d6 pawn is now what we refer to as a backward pawn. Should have explained this to Gukesh, someone says. I don't know what that means. I haven't been following the match. I'm sure that was very funny. But a backwards pawn just means that the weakest pawn is the one that's like doing all the defending, and it can be easily targeted, rather than the other scenario where we saw that the most difficult to attack pawn was the beginning of the pawn chain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Sarah, it doesn't seem weak because it's supported by the queen and bishop.
That's a good observation. So it doesn't seem weak because it's defended twice. We need to go over the definition of a weakness because I forgot to do it. So in chess, the plainest definition of a weakness that I like to use is just any square that cannot be defended by a pawn, or specifically no longer be defended by a pawn. So whether there's a piece on that square or not, in this case, because the square cannot be defended by a pawn anymore, it becomes weak. Because when pawns are defended by other pawns, they're being defended by the lowest on the food chain, so they're easily disposable. So no one really wants to exchange a piece for that pawn. But if these are being defended, if the weak pawn's being defended by pieces, then they can just trade other pieces. And then in an endgame scenario, the king can just kind of come up and grab it, which is why I start with endgames to understand pawn structure, because it's just too hard to understand pawn structure when there are so many things going on. But okay, any other questions? Also, I can't really see your faces because of the light, so whenever possible, like, hello, it's Cheesy Gazebo in the chat. Hello, chess fans. Okay, so I'm kicking so there's a drawback to this move, was my entire point. I'm giving myself kind of a permanent weakness on d6. It's hard to get rid of the weakness by pushing it, because this square is very well controlled by white. This will also show why a6 was important, because in this position, say I played e5 here, this square is already available for the knight and can maybe attack this way. Here, maybe it doesn't make quite as much sense, and this is kind of getting a little too complicated, but the knight can hop back to c4, which is a useful square because it can attack the knight from here, or the pawn from here. This is all theory. It's not very important. But anyway, the drawback of my move, I get a weakness. The plus, I kick a strong knight out of the center. I gain control over a central square. The knight has to retreat. Oh wait, this is not the position. I'm so sorry. The knight has to retreat either to f3 or to b3. Another important thing, and don't take this too literally, because there are exceptions all the time in chess, no matter what, there are no real rules. But generally, moving backwards is not something you want. Chess is about going forwards. What that does not mean is to I've seen people, like, what they have the knight on f3 and they just play the move knight to g4, and then they get kicked back immediately. That's not what I mean. Like, if you're going to play a move that's an advancement but is immediately followed by a retreat, that's not what you want. So, okay, knight b3. I go bishop e7 because it's time to castle, which is the most important thing in the opening, maybe, besides the center and development. They're all important. So my opponent castles, I castle. Bishop e3, developing another piece, contributing to the center, and let's play a game. Let's try and identify as many weak squares as we can. So whether or not they're exploitable, just squares that can't be defended by pawns.
G6.
Do you mean b6? This side? You think g6 is weak? Why do you think g6 is weak?
It is defended by pawns.
Yeah, it's defended by pawns. If I were to move a pawn in front of my king, though, it would create weaknesses. Someone says h8, and this is why I like to modify the definition from a square that cannot be defended by a pawn to a square that can no longer be, because h8 can never be defended by a pawn. The pawns don't start there. Because if that were true, I mean, I guess there is some truth in the fact that the back rank is always weak. I'm sure you've seen like back rank checkmates where the rook comes down because there's nothing on it. So that's a scenario where the back rank can be weak. I wouldn't consider h8 a weakness because it was never defended by a pawn.
So B6 would be.
Yeah, b6 is the one, or one of the main ones I would notice, because that was another drawback of the move a6. When moving pawns, we must be very careful, because pawns are the only pieces, they're not pieces, but they're the only things in chess that when they move, they cannot take it back. When you move a pawn, it's permanent. So every pawn move makes weaknesses and cannot be taken back. So one of the big mistakes I see beginners doing is something my friend's mom, who wrote Tactics Time, co-wrote that book, she called it push pawnitis, and something that like a lot of little kids have is when they don't know what to do, they just start pushing pawns because, I don't know, why not? But without understanding the gravity of the situation, they can't be taken back, they create weaknesses behind them. And so another good reason that bishop e3 is good is because it's looking at this b6 weakness. If then my opponent can put a knight here, that's going to be really annoying for me and kind of be like a semi-outpost for him because I can't kick it away with a pawn. Other weaknesses, d6 is still weak, but typically in all Sicilians, the square, and this is true of most openings where usually you're fighting for 1 to 2 squares. And when you figure out which square you're fighting for, every move starts to make sense. So in the Sicilian, a lot of the time, it's the d5 square, the d5 square, which right now, white has 1, 2, 3 things on, and I only have 1. So white owns this square, which is technically in my territory, so that's not really a great thing. And so that is where the main fight is for, and which is why I played the move bishop e6, because I want to also maybe get rid of my weakness, my d-pawn weakness, and get rid of control over d5 at the same time, and kind of fix my pawn structure. So my opponent plays f3. What could be the point of f3?
Strengthen the chain.
Yeah, it creates a pawn chain. So now the pieces don't have to worry so much about defending that e-pawn. Now this knight is able to move. I would say there are technically maybe 1 to 2 more reasons that f3 is a good move. I also don't think there's any such thing as a bad move unless, as long as you have a reason for playing the move. I mean, unless you're like hanging your queen, maybe your reason was good enough. Someone in the chat says never play f3. Well, this is not a Ben Feingold lecture. Yes, Grandmaster Benjamin Feingold rolling in his grave. So the other points to f3 that I think exist are, number one, he's controlling the g4 square. And this is sort of a common idea that I don't know if anyone has heard, but generally bishops are preferred to knights, especially if you have two bishops, because the bishops together control every square at the same time, but the knights are clumsy. And every time a knight moves, it stops controlling every square that it was controlling previously. And they're difficult to maneuver without always giving up control. So I was kind of maybe thinking about at some point playing knight g4. I can't play it right now because there are two attackers on it, and I only have one defender. But if I were to play queen d7, I can play knight g4 and kind of threaten the bishop. So he's just stopping that altogether. That's kind of a common thing to do in this structure. In this and in perks and things like that. And then the final reason is maybe giving just a little bit of Luft or air for the king and a little bit of retreating space for the bishop. Those would be the main reasons. So here, let's talk about bishops, since they came up. What makes a bishop good and what makes a bishop bad?
A bishop is good if the pawns are on the opposite colored square.
Exactly. So what he said was, if people couldn't hear, your good bishop, and I didn't really specifically ask like what makes something your good bishop and your bad bishop, because usually you have one good bishop and one bad one. If you have two good bishops, you're probably winning. It has to do with the pawns, like most things. So right now, black's dark squared bishop is its bad bishop because the pawns are on dark squares and it's keeping the bishop from being mobile. Bishops enjoy open positions. Knights enjoy closed positions because knights can hop over stuff. And for white, the light squared bishop is maybe a little bit worse because of the pawns like this. I would say this bishop's a little bit better than this bishop anyway, because at least this whole diagonal is sort of open. But meanwhile, this one's kind of entombed. So I played the move knight d7 because I just want to finish developing and then connect my rooks, which is the end of development, I suppose. And my opponent plays the move knight d5, which you'll see a lot in these structures. Just putting a piece on that giant weakness. So what should we do about this? Should we take the knight? Should we ignore it? Should we challenge it? Keep in mind, he's also tickling the b6 square. I did add some extra protection against that, but it's not fun. Also, can anyone tell me the definition of an outpost?
It's a square where you're unlikely to be attacked, but it's past the midline.
That's pretty much entirely right. So a square that you're likely to not be attacked on is true, but more specifically, a square that you're not going to be attacked by a pawn, so a weakness. So this is another reason weaknesses are important. When you put a piece on a weakness, I can't just simply kick you away. That piece is here to stay. An outpost specifically meaning a piece that is on a weakness, typically in your opponent's territory that's already supported by a pawn. So this knight is an outpost, and it's quite a good one. I have options. I can take with the bishop, I can take with the knight, or I can do something else and just like play rook c8, putting a rook on. Rooks enjoy being on open files, so files that have no pawns on them, or semi-open files, which mean files that only have your opponent's pawns, because then because the rooks are long-range pieces. They like to be tucked back and just kind of spying on things from a distance. Someone says, can we develop the knight to its natural c6 square, or is it better to develop to cover our b6 weakness? That's a good question. His question is, would it be okay to also play this move? I don't see any real problems with it. I'm sure that my reasoning did lie kind of entirely on the b6 square, because think about it. So in this position, my hand is forced. I don't have a choice. I have to take, otherwise he puts something here. So I don't know. I think it's better to be safe than sorry and cover your weaknesses a little bit more than you maybe feel you need to. Keep it solid. So I took with the knight. Why did I take with the knight?
To preserve your bishops.
To preserve my bishops, precisely. So typically, this is just another Sicilian thing, but it can be attributed to a lot of chess positions. If you can take the piece on d5 and they have to recapture with a pawn, it's usually a good time to do it, and that's because, oops, I took with the knight. That's because now this file is blocked, which was kind of the access point to my weak d6 square, and it's just not really an outpost that can be used anymore. I think generally, if they have to take with the queen, it's also maybe a little bit better because you can usually kick it right out. But taking it and then replacing it with another piece is not ideal. So in this position, I only have one move, which is bishop to f5, because it's the only square that's, not going to be captured. And now I have two center pawns. My opponent has one. My opponent's center pawn is more advanced and controlling more of my territory. And someone asked me a question today, and their question was, how do I tell if a pawn is strong because it's far advanced, or if it's weak because it's overextended? And my answer was, I don't know, it's hard. You gotta just drill different positions, and eventually the chat, you have to get a feeling for it. So in this position, I would say this pawn is potentially overextended, because in order to be supported by another pawn, they would have to play c4, which can't be supported by b3 right now. It might end up being strong and they might end up breaking through, but it's hard to say. So my opponent plays the move bishop d3, offering a trade of bishops. I don't really have a choice because I can't retreat and I can't get away from this diagonal. My only choice is, should I take his bishop or should I make him take my bishop? I wouldn't say that we're straight calculating heavy lines tonight. You take? Yeah, what do you not like about bishop g6?
Well, if your bishop's taken by the other bishop, then you have to respond with a pawn, which doubles up your pawns and creates a weakness for the king.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I don't want to create doubled pawns and weaknesses around my king unnecessarily. So I just take his bishop. He takes with the queen, same reason that I didn't play bishop g6. If he takes with the pawn, Then we have a new pawn structure entirely. So does everyone know what an isolated pawn is? If not, that would be a fixed pawn. That's a good guess though, because isolation means it's like, cut off. An isolated pawn means that it's a pawn that can no longer be defended by a pawn, so kind of like a weakness. So usually it's a pawn that has no pawns next to it, which then it becomes a weakness because it can be attacked by pieces but not defended by pawns. And here we have two of them, so they become a new pawn structure, doubled isolated pawns. So doubled pawns are usually kind of weak and not ideal because think of the pawns as like little foot soldiers with big shields in front of them with a dagger that they stick out to the sides. That's how I think about pawns. So in front of them, they can't do anything, but they can like stab to the side of them. So right now we have two soldiers, one in front of the other, and it's just kind of redundant. But so we have two, this would be a terrible thing. What about the definition of a pawn island? I'm sorry to bombard everyone with chess vocabulary, but it's my favorite thing. It helps with the communication and such.
Would that be two adjacent pawns?
Yes. I know what you're saying. So yeah, he said, would that be two adjacent pawns? So like, that is technically correct. This is one pawn island. This is one pawn island. But this right here, those are two pawn islands because they're not supporting each other. And a way to determine whose pawn structure is better, one of the many ways, is by counting the pawn islands. Because pawns are like kind of like, has anyone played the Horde variant on Lee Chess? It's a variant where one side has pawns up to here, but no pieces. And the other side has just all the normal pieces. And the object is to capture all the pawns. Has anyone seen the movie The Blob? The Blob. That's kind of what pawns are. They're strength in numbers, and the bigger they are, the more kind of unstoppable they are. But when you separate them into little ones, you can just put it in a jar and put it in the fridge. So I don't know, just making things up. Anyway, that's what he takes with the queen. In conclusion. All right. I played this move, bishop g5. Some more advanced players already understand the point of this. But it's another good discussion point. Why did I play the move bishop g5? Why am I trading pieces? Or maybe specifically, why am I trading the dark squared bishops is a better question.
Not sure. You got three of your pawns on dark squares, but the others on light squares.
So I got two interesting answers. You're essentially right. This is a common idea in the Najdorf, where you try to play bishop g5 to trade off the dark squared bishops, because it's my bad bishop that I'm trading for his good bishop. So that's obviously a favorable trade for me. Someone else said, so it's easier to attack his weakness. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't think it is, but it reminded me of something I left out about isolated pawns. So this is a different situation because it's doubled isolated pawns, so it's much worse. But there's a structure in chess called the isolated queen pawn, which is extremely common. And it's just what it sounds like when one side has a queen pawn in the center that is isolated. And the way to compensate for that weakness is with piece activity. And oftentimes someone will give themselves a bad weakness in exchange for something a little bit different. I guess it would be categorized as an imbalance. So sometimes positions are balanced in the sense that it's equal, everyone has kind of the same pawn structure, same general pieces, but a position can still be equal because you both have different weaknesses and different strengths, and it's just more unclear, but it's still sort of equal. But the object, when your opponent has an isolated queen pawn, your job is to trade as many pieces as possible. Because the more pieces that are off the board, the weaker the pawn becomes, and that's because they can't be defended by pawns. They have to be defended by pieces. So eliminate all the pieces, then your king can just go gobble it up. And then, of course, if you have the isolated queen pawn, avoid trades. Go for activity. Okay, that was all I had to say about that. That's not right. So I'm just trading off the darksword bishops because my darksword bishop sucks, and his is pretty good. So he said no to that. And here's kind of what when I was playing this game, what I identified as the critical position. So we've done a lot of talking about isolated pawns and how bad they are, and how no one wants them, and they're the worst. This is not always true. Like most things in chess, there are exceptions to everything. Right now, my opponent played the move f4, and the heck? I held down the wrong button. And he's saying, okay, I don't want to trade the darksword bishops. What I do want to do is, if you take me, you're left with an isolated pawn. If I don't take him, I have to move my bishop. And then what will happen? If I move my bishop, say, and he takes, okay, I can take with the knight, still left with an isolated pawn.
Sarah, what if you took with the bishop? Took his pawn with your bishop?
If I take the pawn with the bishop, that's a good question. He's banking on the fact that pawn structure-wise, he has 2 pawn islands, I have 3. I have an isolated pawn. He thinks that he's better in this position. That is his idea behind f4. And I think it's similar that even if I ignore it, if I take with the pawn, okay, first of all, he'll destroy my pawn structure around my king. So I'd have double isolated pawns here on the edge. My king is wide open. This is yucky. I don't want this. So I'd probably take first and then get this position, which is similar. Or take this way. And then he has a passed pawn. So a passed pawn is sort of like an isolated pawn. Not really at all. It just means that there are no pawns in its path directly blocking it. Or any pawns in its path that can capture into its path. So no pawns guarding its path in any way. So it's on its way to promotion, which is a very good thing in the endgame. So I guess the decision is, what pawn structure do you want? I'm glad the chat is so shocked that they learned something. That's makes me feel good.
Are you asking, do we want to isolate pawn or pawn island?
Would you like to have an isolated pawn and not have your opponent have a passed pawn? Or would you like to have a more solid pawn structure, equal pawn islands, but have your opponent have a passed pawn? What do you value more? There's not necessarily a wrong answer. So like, do you want a structure, I mean, we'll just say, do you want to structure like this, where you have 3 pawn islands? One of your pawn islands is an isolated pawn, or do you want to position like this, where you have 2 pawn islands? And the reason this is 1 pawn island is because the pawn can be defended by a pawn still. There's still the chance. So it still counts as one entity. But your opponent has this passed pawn. So he already has a big part of the endgame. The main part of king and pawn endgames is just creating passed pawns. That's like the main objective, because that's how you make a queen and you win. So you're kind of in an endgame scenario where something gets traded, your opponent already has an advantage.
You have an open file on C.
I have a semi-open file, the C file.
What if you retreated your bishop to F6?
Oh, bishop to F6, that's also very valid. I don't know why I skipped over that. Yeah, because in this scenario, you could take with the knight or the bishop, but this way the bishop's much better. Maybe I even played, I don't even remember what I played. I'm gonna see what, okay, never mind. Ah, I see. So there's quite a few valid options. I'm actually curious. They're all around the same according to the computer. It's just a style thing, I think. What I decided to do, and this was just based on, if I give myself an isolated queen pawn, what I need is piece activity to compensate for that. So I did a few things that are maybe counterintuitive and contradictory of things we've already said, but I took on F4 and then I traded pieces. Why did I trade pieces after I gave myself an isolated pawn? It does, again, have to do with the fact that I took specifically the dark squared bishop. Kind of a trick question I set up there. So I did leave a little thing out about weaknesses. Something by definition can be a weakness, but if it cannot be exploited, it's not a weakness. Weaknesses must be exploitable. The reason I eliminated the dark squared bishops is because my pawn is on a dark square. And generally I wouldn't go for something like this, but I also had to assess piece activity. So immediately I can follow this up with the move queen to g5. I could have also played knight e5, but it's something I want to keep reserved. So I'm targeting the rook. He has to do something about that right away. I identified his king to be a little bit weak. It only has 2 pawns in front of it, and there's no minor piece. Usually you have a knight next to your king. We refer to the knight on f6 or f3 as a hero knight because it's the only piece defending the biggest weakness and the square that I'm sure a lot of people have gotten checkmated on in their lives. So I'm activating my queen as soon as possible. I'm taking advantage of the newly weakened dark squares that the dark square bishop was keeping under control. And now I have a few ideas. So first of all, where does white put the rook? Another thing about activity, by the way, it's one thing to put a piece on an active square. If that move also forces a retreat from your opponent or even a response, it's even more momentum to keep building your activity. Oh dear, I only have 8 minutes left.
Maybe F3?
Well, so the thing is, if you put the rook on F3, maybe I can play knight E5. F3, I think, is the most good-looking square because then you can kind of kick my queen away and maybe target my king yourself. But because I have this super active outpost for my knight, this weakness can be justified. The other thing is that this knight is really misplaced. And the reason for that is, okay, usually the knight is on C3. It's controlling central squares. But here, it is not. And in fact, I can see some situation where the knight comes to C4. Or even, okay, we talked about the semi-open file. We talked about how the D pawn, if it can be defended by the C pawn, it's not that weak. But now I'm contributing to the attack of that C4 square. If I put a rook on C8, C4 becomes impossible because I'm attacking it twice, and he's only defending it once. And another thing, I'm just pointing this out because I just noticed it. Maybe I noticed it in the game. I kind of have a potential peekaboo for a rook. Right now it's defended, but I just like the geometry of it all. So rook F3 cannot be played. My opponent played rook A to F1 because, of course, retreating is not what he wants. He wants to bring another piece into the game rather than moving a piece he's moved twice for a third time. So I followed up with knight E5. My knight is on an outpost, which is what I'm justifying my so-called inferior pawn structure on. So now he has to make another move responding to me. He plays the move queen F5, and he's offering a queen trade. So, most important, most critical position in the game, a critical position, by the way, is just a position where things are either about to change, have just changed, or, I mean, that's pretty much it. Like something where mass trades have happened or are about to happen, something that's going to change. So critical positions you can spend kind of more time in than you would other positions. Also like big transitions like going into endgames or going from an opening to a middle game, but mostly going into endgames. So I'll give you some pros and cons of trading and not trading the queens. If I trade the queens, I go into an endgame where allegedly this weakness will be more of a weakness. But if I don't trade the queens, I'm not really the one with activity here. It's kind of, white has this giant battery. So, and if I don't trade queens, I have to retreat. I guess my more specific question is D6 exploitable? And does white have any exploitable weaknesses? Just yelling at someone in the chat, you know how it is. All right, because of time, I'm going to spoil what I did. I traded the queens. Uh-oh, arrows. This is because, I mean, it's really a combination of things. The clumsiness of white's pieces, the fact that I have an outpost for this knight, and we did a lot of talking about pawn islands and weaknesses and isolated pawns, and by definition, neither of these two pawns are weak. But here they are, in my opinion, weaknesses, because they can be exploited. This pawn is overextended because in order to defend it, c4 has to be prepared already. And so b3 can't be played because the knight is misplaced. The knight takes quite a bit of maneuvering in order to defend this pawn. And it takes a lot of maneuvering even to attack d6. Meanwhile, I have the c8 semi-open file where I can attack the c2 square. And if I get my rook on c2, the entire second rank is a weakness. And if I get 2 rooks, it's over. Because you know what they say about 2 rooks on the 7th? They're blind pigs, because what do blind pigs eat? Whatever's in front of them. All right. So I played the move knight to c4, which is a fork. What am I forking? I suppose this is maybe... I would teach this game in different ways depending on what class. Like, I would think I would focus more on the lack of harmony of white's pieces for Road to 2000, but it's kind of difficult to explain.
That is not a fork, right?
Oh, it's a fork.
That's a fork?
You can fork, one of the things you're forking can be a fork. You just have to be threatening 2 things. I'm threatening to fork the rooks. Yeah. What else am I threatening? Did you say something?
I think you can take the pawn back there.
Yeah, you're right, b2. So he has to give up something here. So he plays knight to d4, and I think this is what his whole thing was. So he has a little bit of a trick, I think. So after knight to e3... Oh, I was wrong. I was thinking he had this move, which is wrong for about 12 reasons. I guess I just won. So that's a good point to... I guess I just built up the position, and maybe I even calculated that much. But he, instead of giving up a pawn, he decided to give up the exchange, and in turn tried to attack my weakness and give me fewer things to attack his weaknesses with. I think it would be very beneficial to continue going over this endgame, but maybe we'll do that at a later time because we're out of time. But this has been Beginner Breakdown. If anyone in the class has questions, I will answer after I'm done. Next up is Dennis Boros with whatever it is he's doing. Are we? Oh, I didn't say bye. Goodbye. I thought
Hello everyone, this is a cold, bitter Monday. But we're gonna have chess, and it's Monday Masters, and you're all so thrilled. Okay, not as thrilled if I was Sara, but you're still thrilled, and that's what matters. So, brought a couple of games for tonight. So, here's a game I played online. It's not my favorite thing to play online, honestly. It's not what I like to do, but sometimes you do what you have to do. It's better to play than not play at all. And I think that's super important, whether you're starting out, whether you're a seasoned professional. It's really important because I think you just get rusty. You get rusty if you don't play, and it's all about just being trained to see, like whenever they talk about all these patterns and such, patterns really matter so you just don't blunder the whole board and all of your pieces, but it's actually not as important for the game as they make it out to be. But it's a good drill to have, and that's actually kind of when you see you're rusty, when you start to miss all of those patterns that you already know. and things should be working out. All right, so I was playing Grandmaster, I believe from Italy, Dvirnyy, knight c3, knight c6, and the funny thing is that people don't like experimenting, but experimenting is a good thing. Experimenting is good because it actually teaches you things you've never known before. So even though this is like, move 2, what would be an interesting idea here for white? And, no hold bars, just whatever comes to your mind and you think is interesting. And the reason I do this, it's important to sort of free yourself a little bit, because whenever you study theory, oftentimes you sort of get to do the same things over and over again, and you're not really thinking to yourself anymore. All that said, talking about the World Championship match, Ding versus Gukesh. Whatever you're thinking, just let him cook. Let him cook. They'll take care of the rest. All right, so here, what ideas would you guys have? You can go as wild as you want to, or as wild as you need to be. You don't have to be wild. I'm just pushing you guys to be wild a little bit.
That's more experimental.
Anything goes. Experimental is fine. In fact, knight e5 is a funny little move. Now, knight e5 is an option. It's not great because you are not developing any of your pieces, but you're putting a knight in the center. So before, people would be judgmental for this move because you are not developing, and that's super important. However, modern chess, or at least my interpretation, as long as it serves a purpose, it has a goal, you can make that move. This knight d5 move, even though not developing any of your pieces, just centralizing the knight, actually is reasonable because you will need that square later on anyways. So, yeah, fairly exciting. Knight d5 is exciting.
What about f5?
F4. Uh-huh. Survey says F4. I also played it. That's one of them. But let's keep going. Now, B4 is a bit too much. The reason it's too much, it might remind you of this opening, the Evans Gambit. But the big difference here in the Evans Gambit, whenever you give up your pawn on B4, the main point of this is that after takes, you get to attack the bishop. And not just that you attack the bishop, but you get to push the pawn afterwards. So it's actually super duper important. If you can't actually chase it away, it's not going to work. Knight c3, knight c6. Hello, Ellen Chess. And indeed, bishop b5. And bishop b5 is actually another funny move. And it actually is completely normal, yet literally very rarely played. Something I've tried before. And then I saw Firouzja actually play it as well at some moment, sometimes online, I believe. Well, what is this? It's sort of like your casual Spanish. It's practically a Spanish, but your knight is not committed yet to f3. Now, one trick, though, that I will show you is pretty important. Here, knight e2, bishop c5. d3 is ill-advised. Why is that so? And that's about being rusty. Thankfully, I didn't fall for this, even though my opponents actually fell for this idea themselves. And even though there's an upside to this knight b here, but in general, it's just not good. Knight g4, of course. Your biggest problem and worry always should be the f2 square at the beginning of the game. That's the main target. Of course, white can castle. You can't really push the pawn in front. Black just has too many pieces controlling that square. And after that, there's queen h4. And your regular problems, it's a double attack. Yes, you may defend the f2 pawn. You could potentially block it somehow, but you get mated, and that's even worse. So here, it's pretty important that you go h3 or move your knight away, mostly h3, so they don't have this knight g4 jump, and etc., etc. It's a different type of play, but and you might be wondering, well, why do I put my knight on e2? The point is, eventually, white would want to go for those f4 breaks, which is not possible when your knight is already blocking that. Anyways, I went for f4 myself, and e takes. Anytime they give you a pawn, the way you can check it is just capturing it. Now, all of you are big Bong Cloud fans, pretty sure, or many of you are. Now, here is your chance. How do you do it? In fact, it's one of those very few cases where it actually isn't horrendous. Yeah, d4, queen h4, king e2. And the reason why this is like a proper Bong Cloud, because white gets a good grip in the center, and black actually does everything wrong. Black doesn't have any pawns in the center. Black actually gets the queen out way too early. This pawn isn't really in the center, and it's more useless than useful. And many of black's pieces are still in the background. So, in fact, white's play, this is vintage gambit play. And it was obviously very, very popular in the coffee house times. Yes?
I just wondered, when you play f4, is it Vienna gambit or?
Yeah, this is a Vienna.
Vienna gambit?
Well, it's sort of, to be fair, it's, I guess, is a mix. Because, I mean, f4 is the king's gambit, but with this knight c3 involved, it sort of becomes a hybrid. You could still kind of argue that it's somewhat of a king's gambit still. And the reason why this is not, well, of course, you know, tread carefully if you want to try this one. But the thing is, whenever your opponent only has a queen out, they can't checkmate you. They always need a little helper, maybe a pawn, but mostly a piece. You will only get mated if a knight shows up. Otherwise, you won't get mated. And so it's actually trickier than it looks. And, you know, if you manage to surprise your opponent, for sure, you're going to have some fun and interesting games. Now, I played knight to f3. It's sort of a transposition into the king's gambit. This is proper king's gambit. d4, d5, I take, queen takes, bishop f4. And this is not the worst king's gambit you can get, because I've got a center pawn. The black is just as fine. There's not many weaknesses. Maybe this one's a little loose, but also my king is still in the middle, so it's not quite safe yet. So bishop f5, bishop d3. Now, I could potentially take this pawn, but the thing that I noticed later on in my chess career, anytime you sort of just gobble up some pawns, oftentimes you run into the issue of opening files that haven't been opened before, and that can become a problem. Like after takes, rook c8, and then knight b4, like the attack comes quite viciously, and it is partly due to the fact that I lost time. Like whenever you take a pawn, well, you gain material, but you lose time in general, which is an issue. So I go bishop d3, castles c3, and one of the things, I mean, it was kind of a learning curve when I was trying to understand these positions. What's super important, once you have the c3, d4 structure, your king does not have to castle. Like, even if I put my king on f2, that's actually quite safe, because I've got a knight covering the king, and black is not yet ready to put some pressure on my king. And in fact, like, this is one of those things, and one of the few occasions when it is kind of nice to have white, because I've got the center, and the only thing that compensates for black is that my king is a little bit iffy. So c3, bishop d6, my opponent is just playing it solid, just trades. Now, I always have to be careful because my king is in the middle, but, whoop, I'm running away. Rook e6, and this is the moment we actually start or look at the position. What are your first impressions? That's sort of the first way we look at things, and then we sort of wonder of what moves we'd like to play in this position ourselves.
Bring the rook over and try to take the file.
Mm-hmm. Which one?
The one on the left.
This guy? This one. I know. This guy?
That one, yeah.
Okay. Over here. Yeah. Yeah, so rook e1?
Yeah. Oh no, but then you're losing the pawn. Sorry, the other one.
Yeah.
You lose the pawn that one.
Yeah, so Visionary is asking why, what happened with the king e2. Well, that wasn't the game. It's just an option. In that case, yeah, the pawn might become loose, although that's always double-edged. Whenever they take that pawn, that's somewhat ill-advised. But I like the idea. In general, you want to tend towards those files. Yeah?
Two thoughts about the position.
Okay.
The first one's tactical. So I'm assuming c4 with the idea d5 doesn't work because c4, queen d7, d5, and rook d6.
So c4, queen d7, rook d6. Yes?
And so that leads me to think, okay, maybe you need to fight for the file, but I don't think you're winning the e file. Maybe something like knight d2 and try and just cover the f file, especially since f7 is weak here. If you can encourage them to play f6, it slows down the pawns on the king's side.
So, in general, they're not going to push those pawns too far. And even if they do, like that e5 square could become really, really nice for my piece if they don't pay close enough attention. And this is actually one of the traps we fall into, is that we consider a couple of moves, make it 2 or 3, sometimes 1 if we're completely out of ideas. But oftentimes we get so deep into the tank that we start considering moves that aren't quite good and they kind of miss the mark. And actually it's important that you sort of check back of what's going on, or if you actually usually guess your directions, that's sort of the ballpark you want to play, you don't want to actually overstep the line. But okay, let's see what I played. I did go c4. Rook e1 is fine. I'm still a little worried with the a pawn, even though you could call that a sacrifice. Like, even if they win that pawn, That's always double-edged. You don't always want to take a pawn at wherever your king is at, because it's always an issue. Now c4, I want to go d5, and honestly, even if you don't necessarily win the game with the idea, but I mean, you see it doesn't win, you may still want to do it anyways, because I'm expanding and trying to put pressure on those pieces. So queen e4, rook d1. I notice that, of course, if I take, rook takes, there's going to be a lot of pressure on those pawns on d4 and then on c4. So felt like my queen is hanging, I might as well defend it, the d3. So takes, rook takes, and now again, black, seeing that there is this trick on d5, this fork, goes rook to e2. Okay, so we made a little bit of an effort. We got the rook into the game. Also notice I made sure my d-pawn was overprotected. And I think that's super important because oftentimes if you just don't protect your key center pieces, center pawns, that's when you lose those pieces in the process. Now, our opponent is getting, greedy. And that's good. That's good play. Greed is good. Now we just have to figure out how we could respond to that. And especially when your opponent is getting aggressive, that's when it's even better to have a wider net of ideas. Because if you choose one defense and that one defense is wrong, well, that's when you lose the game. So when you have a good position and you choose whichever, it doesn't really matter because you still have a great position. It doesn't mean a thing. But here, whenever it's about defense, you have to tread carefully. So rook f2, of course, is one idea, just overprotecting. Fortunately for us, my knight is there to cover the e1 square, so they can check me if I go rook f2. So rook f2 over defends everything, but, just because they're attacking you doesn't mean you necessarily have to defend directly. I can block, but if I block with the knight, okay. So, but if I block with the knight, there's a very nasty trick of removing this defender. If that rook has to move, we're lost. I can go here, unfortunately. Otherwise, it'd be a good block. But then now, if I move, we're lucky that we don't lose the piece immediately. But I do win the pawn on d4. And my rook is not too happy there. And in general, I'm more on the side of if they attack you with the rook, block it with the rook. Don't actually put a piece to block it away because this will be always under direct pressure. Even if you're not losing, you can't move. So it's better just to try to diffuse the attacks of the rook. Rook d2, same problem though, with both of my defenders moving away, the d-pawn falls. Yeah. Well, you're not really forking c7.
Oh, sorry.
Because, yeah, no, it's fine. Yeah, you do win a couple of pawns, but in general, like, once your rook is not on the open files, is in front of the pawns, it's a bad sign. You want to avoid that as much as possible.
If you jump with the knight and pressure the black pawn up there, you have two pieces playing at it. And you can take it, try to...
So I like this idea. You're trying to be aggressive. But yes, the problem, though, is that they can chase you away, and no longer is there enough attack on the f-pawn. In fact, you can't even really go in there because the knight is going to get trapped. And the funny part is, though, is that in many cases, this might actually be better of a move, that in this case, because is undefended, then I might actually get to escape somehow, still. So this is actually the good news when you're good at tactics. It's kind of a get out of jail card in chess. You get to trick yourself out of trouble, which is not possible in most of the cases if you don't know those. If you don't know these tricks. So rook f2 is fine, but of course there's d5, right? So now you looked at all these moves, rook f2, but it's actually important to look for ideas when you're attacking. Counterattack is also a very good form of defense, and is probably the strongest form of defense. Yeah, so they did go knight b4.
And so that's where I was like, okay, then, all right, then.
Okay, well, yeah. What did you say? So d5, knight b4, because I heard someone said something. Okay, I knew I heard someone. Okay, and indeed, d5, and here my opponent sort of misunderstands the situation. My opponent feels that he's got an active rook, so therefore he is better, and makes an aggressive move. And that's actually the reason it's important to realize who's in control. Because if you realize your opponent is in control, you really should be a bit more timid and a little bit more reserved. If they're attacking you, be more conservative. Here, knight to d8 is so much better of a move, and it's even a joke that I'm saying so much better of a move. The knight is awful on d8, but because black's pieces needs to get defended, it defends this weak pawn on f7, this knight is much better on d8 than it will be on b4. Because when you have a bad position or a position where you're worse, you're actually just playing with fire when you're initiating action. Because of course, your opponent has a superior position. All sorts of complications should favor the stronger side. So knight b4 for that reason is not that great. So knight b4, rook b3, that is correct.
So they can't take a2. They can take a2, right?
Can they?
I don't think so.
Okay, tell me why not.
Because then you can just play rook a1.
Yeah, here and the knight is trapped.
Okay.
So, yeah. And it's actually interesting. Many people know how to defend a little bit, but some people are more resourceful than others. And rook b3 might have been a move that was just not on the radar of my opponent. Probably not assuming that, because it's a double attack, but I actually happen to defend both of them. So knight a2, but then rook a1. and knight c2 happened. Now, my opponent could still go knight a6, but that's even worse. What is your knight doing there? And in a lot of cases, though, what's important is that when you're doing defense, that's when weird moves might become okay. Now, you want to avoid them 90% of the time. More like 99% of the time, you want to avoid these weird-looking rook moves. But, you know, when push comes to shove, that's what you have to do. But normally, like if you can, you go for rook to f2. Like rook to f2 was suggested, and it's a completely fine move. Try to avoid self-pinning. Anyways, I went for d5. Rook b3, knight c2. Go rook f2 now. Pawns are already defended. Rook here. Rook c3. My opponent goes knight e1. Now the thing is, white has to be a little bit better because I've got pawns in the center, and those pawns can eventually become pass pawns. Unlike black's, these pawns are far away from ever actually becoming pass pawns, and my king is on that side. Now the king is there too, but it's also as much of a blessing as it is a curse because it's easier to attack. My opponent goes knight to e1, and knight e1 is actually a big mistake. And it's probably that my opponent thought that this works, but it does not. Is this a lecture? Yes, it is a lecture. So it is white to move, and white has a very, very cute little idea. I played against plenty grandmasters, and grandmasters often miss details. They don't miss moves. They kind of, they're good. They don't miss big ideas, but they miss little details, and sometimes those little details actually just decide the game. Nick, you've got it, I think. Right?
I know the idea. I don't know the first move.
Okay.
Is it knight d4 or is it take the rook? But you're gonna go
So you got the idea of knight d4 or rook takes. Okay.
But I want to play king f1. And knight and the rook.
So you are working on it. I can tell that you're working on it. You've got the idea of rook takes. You've got the idea of knight d4. And that's good. Even if you don't know the solution, it's important to have all those moving parts. It's actually better to have moving parts than just throwing out moves. Why? Well, the reason is that while you have all these pieces moving around, you will be connecting the dots. Your brain will help you out, hopefully. And most of the times, your brain does, so trust in your brain. That's my advice. Also, hello, Witch Pawn. Good to see you as well. Now, oftentimes the way I attack positions is I try to look at what is sort of suspicious looking in my opponent's position. What's so suspicious in this position for the black side? This knight looks pretty sussy on e1, to put it mildly. But there are some other issues as well. The f-pawn is somewhat undefended. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes you're looking at it and you have no ways of getting to it. Like we tried knight g5 before, but then they have this f6 idea. But you still should look for it, even if you don't actually come to the conclusion that it works, or if it's fine. Because sometimes it actually becomes the best move, and it's better to look at it for that reason.
Play something like f6, you have knight e6, and it covers knight e.
And so here, knight e6, cutting off the communication, which is always great. Yeah, knight g5, for now, looks promising. We also had knight d4, rook e2, still on the plate. Is knight g5 the fan favorite here at the chess club? Dissenting opinions, even in chat, are welcome. You can also agree. It's not illegal to agree with the knight g5 sentiment either.
I like knight d2. Knight d4, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, okay. Okay. Oh. Mm-hmm. Well, some of you have your brains on. You should turn your engines off. Never forget that. Now, of course, sometimes you just want to be in the know, but it actually is much better and a better way of improving if you're trying to solve it and then sometimes failing. Because you actually learn patterns, you actually learn new ideas yourself. And you might get more emotionally invested than just clicking the space bar. Not to mention, it's illegal. So knight g5, knight d4. Now, the only thing that I'm sort of waiting for is just like, you can be more aggressive. Like both of these moves, they're relative, but like they're mildly aggressive. Take the rook, okay? I take back. Exactly. See? Tracy's got it.
But the problem was if they take on f3 with check first. That was what was giving me.
Okay, so take here. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, knight king f4 or f2.
And just king f2, and you just ignore it because you took a higher value, a rook, and they got a knight. Well, we don't care. We have this in between king move, and then, of course, if they take this, I can take this. Now, probably one of those things that my opponent could have missed is either of two things. One of them is that I move my king to f2, and it defends the rook, just like as Nick said. Or the idea that after rook takes, I have this king f1 move. And this is one of those things when that little king move becomes so powerful, and it is the one double attacking with a little bit of a help of the knight on f3. And often I noticed that people underestimate how powerful a king attack can be. So like that's why these kind of moves are often misunderstood and missed. So rook takes, of course they're still trying, and one thing with knights, that knights are a bit clumsy. And, you know, I'll be critical. I didn't play this game perfectly, but I tried. Okay, so white is, of course, up a piece, but is there some hidden dangers in the positions that we may want to keep in mind? There is an A pawn. It is something to work. Eric Blair, I trust in you. I was sure that you were figuring it out on your own. So for that reason, I bring my knight closer. A5, C5, and probably I could have played H4 earlier. One of the things that's super important when you have a winning position is that you still shouldn't have the jitters. And I think many people get the jitters, like people become antsy that they're winning, I'm winning, oh my goodness, I'm winning the game. And that's when you make a mistake. And you know, there's nothing wrong with making mistakes. The problem is that emotions take you over. Like they just take over your whole system, and that's when you can't think straight or clearly. So I played C5, A4, F6, King D7, D6, H5, H4, B5. Now opponent should have taken on D6, but chose B5 and thought that, hey, I am going to have an easy time just breaking your pawn structure, because if I just move the knight, well, then those pawns actually become really dangerous. But here comes another big surprise for my opponent and hopefully for you too. Well, hopefully not for long, because this is a very, very cute little idea that you hopefully will find. It's white to move and actually make it showtime. Okay, so knight b6, of course, the question is, what if I take? And c6, okay, so knight b6 captures c6, I take. So knight b6, oh. Yeah, push c7 and then you promote. Yes, so knight b6 takes, here, 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 promotion. Now, this is like the pure promotion, especially when your opponent will have two pawns running. It's not enough that you promote, it has to be a queen. Because if they sacrifice something for the pawn, those pawns actually can become treacherous. But it's not over. It's not over yet. So, you know, part of finding solutions is respecting your opponent's resources. So try to find the best defensive move here for black. King c8. Mm-hmm.
No, I guess you have to go c7 first. Go d7, there's king c7.
D7, king c7. So you can c7.
Then you have to look at b4.
So what's super important is to not get overconfident, because cold shower comes at these times, and this is the most painful thing you'll ever have playing chess. These are the worst moments. So tread carefully. Be very careful. So you're really close with the pawns, right? It's almost painful how close we are. We're at the finish line. Well, we gotta find a way to push on through. So we got rook e3 as a consideration. We've got these pawn pushes. I mean, there's not that many other moves left, right? Like, those are the most straightforward ones. So if you're asking me, well, how should I solve this? Go one by one. So what's the consensus? What would be your move here?
I like the rook e3.
Okay, rook e3.
King d8, c7, d7, and rook e8.
Okay, so we've got rook e3 fans. Okay. Is that the only idea? Is that the final one, rather?
The attack is pawns on that. That's the only good.
I mean, if we attack pawns, here, obviously, we'd rather mate or promote. Winning a pawn, I mean, if you promote, you get a value of 10, measly pawn won't make us much happier. Now, there was one nasty moment. c7 is bad, because I go here, I stop your d-pawn, and you lose. This is actually the stone cold truth about chess. If you are not accurate enough, you can lose in chess, even if you were winning a moment ago. Chess is a cruel game like that. Yeah, so c7, rook here. Problem being, if d7, of course they won't take with the king, they'll take with the rook.
I think you're fast enough also for king 1 here. Rook e4.
Well, c7 here, and I will pick up the pawn. One pawn is not, like, if the pawn is blocked, it's not going to move anytime soon. Come on, people. Be aggressive. Be aggressive. You like American football? Just reach the finish line. Well, I've got some questions there. If a couple of moves there are okay, well, white isn't looking to make an okay move. There are many okay moves. Would be looking for the one that just mops it up. Endings are always about time. But again, I mean, why would you go after the pawn?
I mean, I still like rook e3 more.
Okay. I mean, rook e3 could be fine, but, you know.
I was thinking maybe we just didn't have it yet.
All right. I mean, look, at the end of the day, you make your decisions. May it be good or bad, I don't know.
Pawn c7 if you fix with the rook and you move your rook up.
Well, I mean, here.
What if you then move your rook up?
So
He goes over, now you move yours up there.
yeah, but the issue is that I am going to go push this pawn, rook takes, and here comes the kicker. Of course, this looks nasty, but it only works because this pawn is defended. Here, black has this spectacular move of rook takes. And you can't promote because no longer does this have a defense.
You would take his rook there, right?
Well, yeah, but these pawns, they're menacing.
When you go over.
Well, you can try, but you are complicating your life a lot. Okay, but how would you try, though?
Rook b6.
Rook b6, I go here.
Oh, yeah.
You're still doing fine, though. You can still actually go here. And now the pawn can't move. You really have to tread carefully. Even the king moves, but the rook can also defeat the pawns. Like you can go here and slowly pick up the pawns one by one. But as you could see, this was razor edge close, right? It was really close. You barely made it. It's not a bad idea, but after rook d2, things slow down excruciatingly. So c7 is definitely not ideal. But white has better. Much better. Because like rook e3, which is probably is winning too, like c7, push in there, but you got an immediate win. Rook d3, okay. Rook d3. King d8, very good. Because if d7 here, and one of the things with chess, which some find it painful, but it's a symmetrical game. Ideas are often symmetrical. What you face with black, you often face with white. It's sort of the same thing here. White is sort of suffering the same consequences. If c7, I go here. But the funny thing will be is that the solution, even there, like rook d3 also wins. For the same reason, this move, which I'm hoping you'll find, wins as well. So I'll give you the basic 101 on how to promote in chess. Choose a square of your promotion. Choose one square where you'd like to push on through. Go from there. Choose one. C8. Okay. You choose C8. Now, okay, so actually that now I understand you guys' problem. Because here, in this case, you can't make C8 work. But you can make D8 work.
So king e1 to take away rook d2.
Well, that's my idea.
King e1, okay. And what is your idea? Let's say I push the pawn. King e1, push the pawn.
Rook c4.
Push the pawn.
c7.
Ah, okay, so you're doing that. Okay. Here, I can also still try checking you. But I get it. I give full credit for king e1. All right. In this one, you can promote on the c8 square. I'm not giving up. People, I'm not giving up. Trust me, I'm helping you.
Oh. c7, and then king d7, rook c3.
King c8.
Then d7.
C7 check. I can go here because d7 and promotes. And here, I go to c3. If you block, then d7, and bye-bye. King takes and queens. So, if you can promote on c8, can you promote on d8? Run that back? No. No. Now. Come on. We're at the finish line. We're not leaving until we solve this. What is the first move you guys are thinking about? Tracy? Oh, okay. d7 check. And of course, queen. So the funny thing is, it's very important to know that the two pawns and the rook can force the way. What's important is that the rook on a2 should never join the fray in the defense. Because if that joins the defense, as it happened here, it's very difficult to push the pawns anymore. But it's important to notice that this is sort of not your typical way of winning, but is the way I won the game with rook d3 and then c7 queens. All right, so I really hope you guys learned a thing or two with this technique, and hopefully I inspired you all for some creative chess. So thank you for coming.